I used to believe that honor was the one thing a soldier could never lose. They can strip your uniform, erase your record, even turn brothers in arms against you, but honor, that was supposed to be untouchable. I learned how wrong I was the day they took mine with a single stamped file and a room full of silent faces. My name is Maria Hayes. 4 years ago, I was a captain in military intelligence. I had spent over a decade serving a country I would have died for. Then, overnight, I became something else, a traitor, a liability, a name no one dared to speak. There was no trial, no chance to defend myself. My access was revoked. My service history scrubbed clean, and just like that, I vanished. I built a quiet life after that, a small town in Texas, a repair shop that paid in grease and long hours. I told myself I was done fighting. I almost believed it, until last night, someone left a letter at my door. No signature. No return address. Just 8 words written in a hand I haven't seen since the war. Echo file still lives, and so does the truth. I knew then that someone inside the system had buried more than my career. They buried evidence, questions, maybe even bodies. This time I am not chasing redemption. I am hunting the truth. And if I have to dig through every lie they used to destroy me, I will. If you've ever lost everything to a story written by someone else, stay with me. Because truth never sleeps. This is military revenge. Subscribe if you believe some battles are fought long after the war ends. I remember the sound before I remember the faces. A hard knock 3 times like the butt of a rifle against metal. My eyes shot open in the dark. I knew that rhythm. It was not a drunk soldier stumbling back to his bunk or a neighbor's argument filtering through thin walls. It was the arrival of authority, of judgment. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. 2:13 a.m. No one with good news comes at that hour. I sat up slowly, my instincts crawling back over my skin like an old uniform. I had not worn one off base for months, not since I was transferred stateside from Kabul. Still, my body remembered how to move quietly, how to breathe without giving away fear. The knock came again, followed by the hollow creak of the door opening. They did not wait for permission. 2 men stepped inside, both in black military uniforms stripped of name tags. Plain clothes would have been kinder. The absence of insignia felt like a verdict before a word was spoken. I stood but did not speak. They did not salute. They did not ask if I understood. One of them opened a folder and began reading from it, voice flat and grainy. Maria Hayes, you are under military apprehension for violation of Article 18A, unauthorized dissemination of classified intelligence. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties and your clearance is revoked. He looked at me only once to confirm I was listening. That was all I was allowed. I said nothing. It was not courage, it was a calculation. In the military, silence is a uniform of its own. It tells them nothing. It admits nothing. And yet that night, my silence felt different. It felt like the last possession I still controlled. They handcuffed me without resistance. My wrists had known harsher pressure during survival training, but the touch of military steel, when turned inward, cuts deeper than any battlefield wound. Before they led me out, I looked at the only thing still hanging on my wall, a folded flag under glass, given to me when Sergeant Roland Hayes, my father, was buried in Arlington. He once told me that honor does not make you bulletproof. It just tells you which way to fall when the bullet finds you. Outside, the corridor was empty except for one figure, Sergeant First Class O'Neill. He had not been assigned to me for years, but he had always been the one man who treated silence with reverence, not suspicion. Our eyes met only briefly. His lips barely moved. Find the echo file and trust no one. He stepped back before they noticed he had spoken. They loaded me into the back of a transport van. No words, no light, just the engine and the sound of my own breathing. I focused on the rhythm of my pulse, a trick I learned in field ops. Find something inside yourself no one can confiscate. I counted. 5 beats, breath in. 5 beats, breathe out. It was all I had left that was mine. We arrived not at a courtroom nor a brig, but at a decommissioned logistics facility on the outskirts of Quantico, a place where things were stored, forgotten, or erased. They marched me through a hallway lined with old equipment cages, generators that would never hum again, radios that would never speak, and somewhere between those walls I felt it. I had already been ghosted. They placed me in a temporary holding bay, no windows, no clock, just a single chair bolted to the floor. Across from it, a scarred metal table stained with old rings of coffee and interrogation. On that table they set a government-issued laptop, powered on, logged in, awaiting my acknowledgement like a snake coiled on steel. The taller of the two men rotated the screen toward me. A line of code blinked across a terminal window. It was a credential string, my credential string. The operator tag appended to it was one I had memorized long ago, Hayes M, and below it, a sequence of intrusions, timestamped to 0147 hours, into a restricted intelligence channel known internally as Fenris Gate. Access that had transferred encrypted field data regarding an active reconnaissance mission near Jalalabad. 47 minutes later, that unit lost all comms. 9 dead confirmed. This was your breach, he said, not a question. I stared at the cursor blinking on the screen. In forward operations, a blinking cursor is a heartbeat. Here. It was a noose. I could have spoken then. Could have asked who authorized this tribunal where the chain of command was, why a full Article 32 investigation had been bypassed. But questions require futures, and I could feel mine collapsing, ribs inward. Instead, I lifted my eyes to theirs. They waited, perhaps hoping for an admission or a plea. I gave them neither. In the army, silence can be insubordination. In intelligence, it can be a weapon if I spoke too soon. I risked handing them the blade they intended to use. One of them, the younger one, shifted. His jaw clenched when I failed to beg. He had been briefed to expect denial, but not defiance. Defiance unsettles men trained to deliver edicts rather than confront mysteries. They left me in that room, no attorney, no commanding officer, no advocate, just the glow of that cursor. I studied it, searching for anomalies, traces of tampering, but what chilled me most was the precision. Whoever fabricated this trail knew my syntax, my keystroke cadence, even the aliases I used in mirrored systems. This was not amateur framing. This was someone wearing my identity like a second skin. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time dissolves when you are measured against a crime you did not commit by accusers who already know the outcome. When the door opened again, it was not a lawyer. It was a recorder, a single lens blinking red mounted on a tripod. They were ready to capture a confession I would never give. A colonel I had never seen entered. JAG insignia, silver eagle, eyes like a closed door. She sat across from me, clasped her hands, and recited charges formally as procedure demanded. Espionage, dereliction, conspiracy, 9 counts of involuntary manslaughter. She asked if I had anything to say in my defense. I told her only one sentence. Justice does not always wear rank. She blinked at that, not in understanding. I'm irritated. She terminated the session and ordered my transfer, but before she left, she made one final notation on her pad. The subject remains uncooperative, displays no remorse. That was the last time anyone asked me what I knew. I was processed, stripped of clearance, and ejected with dishonorable status pending final adjudication. No trial, no board, just exile, and a silence that followed me like a stray dog. You may think the worst wound a soldier can endure is shrapnel or fire. It is not. The worst wound is disbelief. When your own uniform turns its back and walks away, not out of certainty, but convenience. Years later, when strangers ask how I survived it, I tell them the truth. I did not survive it, not all of me. Parts of who I was remain locked in that room, across from that cursor, waiting for someone to ask the right question. There are stories the army never tells, stories written not in ink, but omission. Mine was erased before it was even read. But erasure is not death, it is a challenge. Some of you listening now might think this is the beginning of a redemption tale. It is not. Redemption is a luxury. This is something different. This is reclamation. Because the night they took my honor, I learned something that would take me 4 years to accept. If they can take it with a lie, I can take it back with the truth. And that is exactly what I intend to do. If you are still with me, then you already understand. Not every battle is fought on foreign soil. Some begin in the silence after your name has been erased. This is only the beginning. They released me just after sunrise. No ceremony, no convoy, just a plastic bag with my belongings and a manila envelope with orders I did not sign. My rank was stripped from every document. Captain had become nothing. Maria Hayes, dishonorably discharged, barred from all federal facilities until further notice. I stood outside the perimeter fence at Quantico, no vehicle, no escort, just cold February wind gnawing through a borrowed coat. If they could have erased my shadow, they would have left me without that too. There were no reporters, no inquiries. A disappearance creates no echo. The army did not need to defend itself against accusations because I had never been formally accused. The perfect execution of an unspoken verdict. The first week afterward, I barely spoke. I stayed in a motel off Interstate 95, the kind of place where no one asks how long you plan to stay or why you don't turn on the lights. I memorized every crack in the ceiling just to anchor myself somewhere. Outside my window, truck engines rumbled through the night, bound for places I could no longer afford to dream of. My phone rang twice, both from numbers I recognized. Both times I let it ring, I knew the pattern. First, they check if you're alive, then they wait to see if you'll beg. I wouldn't give them either. On the 8th day I answered. It was Corporal Diaz, one of the few I once trusted. His voice held something between panic and pity. "Captain, I mean Maria, what the hell happened?" I told him only one thing. The uniform stayed on me longer than it stayed in you. He didn't call again. That was how it went. Some avoided me out of fear, others out of convenience, a few like Diaz. Tried to bridge the silence, but realized it required more courage than combat. The army teaches you about abandonment in subtle ways. The empty bunk after a night raid, the missing name during roll call, but nothing prepares you for when that absence is you. I tried applying for civilian security work, positions guarding warehouses, managing surveillance logs, training corporate teams on digital integrity. Every application came back the same. No response, or worse. Polite refusal. My background check triggered something deeper than disqualification. I had become a national cautionary tale told in classified briefings, the unnamed example of betrayal. It was during one of those long nights in the motel that I began to question my memory. Trauma warps images. What if I had missed something? A line of code I didn't recognize, a hand I didn't see. What if I had actually triggered that breach unknowingly? Madness wears curiosity like a mask. I turned on the television just to drown my thoughts. That was when I saw it, a ticker scrolling beneath a news report about reconstruction funds in Afghanistan. 9 servicemen killed in an incident still under internal review. No details, no names, but I knew. Jalalabad does not bleed in silence. Their faces returned to me then, not as ghosts, but as men I had shared rations with. Men who complained about sandstorms, wrote letters home, fought over baseball scores, real people, real weight, and now their deaths had become the brick wall sealing me into exile. Guilt is an inheritance no one wants, but once given, it cannot be returned. I carried it like a stone in my chest, not because I caused their deaths, but because I lived while their story ended with my name attached. Eventually, I left the motel and drove south until the signs read Texas. My mother had family near Abilene, though I had not spoken to them since my father's funeral. I found work at a salvage yard stripping engines. It was paid in cash, no forms, no questions. At night, I slept above the shop in a converted loft that smelled of oil and metal shavings. Strangely, it felt safer than any barracks I had known. Soldiers abide by orders. Machines obey only physics. Months turned into years. I kept my head down, my hands busy. Some locals knew I was military once, but they did not pry. In that part of Texas, everyone carries scars, some visible, some carried in silence. They respected the kind that bleed inward. There was a diner I visited on Fridays, old linoleum floors, pie in metal tins. A waitress named Lewin who wore her hair in a messy braid and never asked why I avoided the mirror behind the counter. One evening, she poured me coffee and said, "Have you ever thought about going back?" Back where, I asked. "Anywhere that needs you." I almost laughed. The army had made sure there were no such places. Still, her question lingered, like static. It followed me to sleep, prying at some locked door inside. That was the first time I dreamed of O'Neill again. Not as he was, but as a silhouette at the end of a corridor, whispering the same words. Echo file, find it. I woke drenched in sweat, my dog tags clutched in my hand. They were the only thing I kept from that life, not the originals. Those had been confiscated. I had a duplicate made in Kabul before everything collapsed. Roland Hayes, United States Army, blood type O, Catholic. I realized then I had been wrong all along. I was not hiding, I was waiting. The past did not haunt me, it hunted me, and hunters only stop when something ends. One afternoon, while replacing a catalytic converter, I cut my palm on a shard of metal, nothing severe. But the sight of blood on steel pulled me back to a moment I had worked so hard to bury. The night in Jalalabad when we recovered 2 wounded after an ambush. I had carried Private Dawson on my back for half a mile, his throat torn open by shrapnel. He died before we reached the medevac. His blood soaked through my vest. I can still feel its heat. That memory had built the life I once lived, and now it demanded tribute. So when the letter arrived, slipped under my door without sound, without signature, I did not freeze. I moved toward it with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment in dreams. 8 words, handwritten in blue ink. Echo file still lives, and so does the truth. My first instinct was to burn it. My second was to follow it. The truth is, I had been waiting for permission to return, not from them, from myself. I packed a single duffel bag, 2 changes of clothes, my dog tags, and a USB drive I kept for reasons I never admitted. Before I left, I locked the shop and walked to the fence line where rusted trucks slept in rows. The sun was sinking behind them, bleeding orange into the horizon. I placed my palm against the hood of a broken Ford and whispered a prayer my father taught me. God, if justice sleeps, wake it with fire. As I turned to go, I felt something ease in my chest, not relief, readiness. Some will say I went back to clear my name. They are wrong. I went back to rewrite the ending. If you are listening, understand this. Titles can be revoked, files can be buried, honor can be rewritten, but there is one thing they cannot prepare for. A soldier they thought was gone, and I had just started walking back into their world. People in town called me the ghost captain long before they knew I had ever worn a uniform. I earned the name not through stories, but through absence. I kept to myself at the garage, worked double shifts when I could, and disappeared on the days I could not pretend to be useful. The mechanics I worked beside never asked about my past. They only knew I was stronger than I looked, that I never backed away from an engine running too hot, and that I carried an unease in my eyes that did not come from labor. 4 years in that Texas town taught me something war never did, that silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is just the longest echo of something unfinished. I lived above the garage in a loft with low ceilings and a single window facing west. Each evening, as the sun dropped behind the mesquite trees, the sky would burn red against the horizon. Red always brings back the desert. Not the kind that poets write about, the kind that eats bone and memory. Sometimes on those evenings, I'd reach inside my duffel and trace the cold stenciling on my dog tags just to remind myself that I once had a name the army could not erase. I might have stayed like that if the letter had never found me. It arrived without a sound, slid beneath my door while I slept. No envelope, no return address. Just a folded sheet of paper bearing 8 words that struck like a detonator. Echo file still lives, and so does the truth. I must have read it 30 times before I let myself breathe. My first instinct was to lock the door. My second was to pack. That is how I knew the past was no longer behind me. It had doubled back. It was waiting, breathing beside me. I closed the shop early that evening. For the first time in years, I did not clock my hours. I drove north, long into the night until the sky turned from black to a tired gray. I did not fully understand why I was heading to El Paso, only that something inside me believed the answer had always lived in the desert. The place I sought was not on any map. It was an abandoned auxiliary training site used during pre-deployment exercises. Most called it Sierra Annex. We called it the Bone Yard. Everyone who trained there left something behind: sweat, blood. A promise made under breath. When I reached it, the gate stood broken and the padlock rusted in half. Chain link curled inward like a wound improperly closed. Inside, the barracks had collapsed into themselves, roofs sunken like broken backs. Wind moved through shattered windows with a hollow hum, repeating nothing but empty air. Still, I knew where to go. Behind the western barracks was a retaining wall built to shield the yard from flash floods. I had been stationed there once, training a signals unit. I remembered the loose stone in the corner. Even then, it bothered me. Someone had shifted it from the inside. I knelt, brushed dirt away, and found it exactly where memory told me it would be. A shallow cavity lined with a strip of weathered tarp. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a hard drive, military issue, black casing, no label, the kind used in encrypted field kits. For a long time, I held it without moving. Years of exile balanced in my palm. Whoever left it had known I would return, or believed I must. I brought it back to Texas. For 2 nights, I sat in my loft curling and uncurling my fists around that drive. I knew I could not open it alone. The encryption protocols used by our signals division were not standard. They evolved, adapted. Some even contained embedded ciphers that could self-erase under the wrong access. That was when I reached out to Duke. I had met him once years before Afghanistan during a digital breach investigation in Arlington. He was no soldier, he never wore rank, but he served his country in ways far more dangerous, a ghost in his own right. Though his battlefield was circuitry, I found him where rumor suggested he would be a shipping container turned residence behind a scrapyard outside Amarillo. When I arrived, he was already on the porch, smoking the end of a cigar no longer lit. He looked at me and grinned, Captain Hayes, or should I say Citizen Hayes. I didn't reply. He stood, motioned me inside, past walls stacked with obsolete servers and transistor boards. What do you need decrypted? He asked. Not if what. I placed the hard drive on his workbench. He lifted it gently, whistled. Military encryption. Old but teeth still sharp. You realize, he said, whatever is on here will not make your life easier. I lit a cigarette I didn't want. You're assuming my life is still something that can be made harder. He laughed at that, not kindly, just knowingly. Then he connected the drive for 3 hours. I stood behind him as lines of code scrolled across the monitors. More than once, he had to pause and recalculate, murmuring to himself. Then, at last, the screen froze, not fully decrypted, but partially bled open. A sliver of memory exposed. He zoomed in on a block of access logs, alphanumeric signatures, routing data, time stamps. One line pulsed at the center like a vein. ID Pierce Auth 76B. I felt the air leave my lungs. Alan Pierce, my commanding officer, the same man who signed my initial commendation, the same man who testified I was a threat to national integrity. Duke leaned back, studying me. You still think this is about clearing your name. It's not. It's about pulling a thread, and threads lead to wires, and wires lead to detonators. He closed the file. Half is still sealed. I can crack the rest, but understand something. You're not the first to seek justice, but you may be the last who survives it. I took the drive and stepped outside. My hands trembled only when I reached for the flame. The cigarette tip flared, and I stared at it until it steadied. General Pierce once told me loyalty is the highest form of discipline. I repeated it out loud, smoke curling through my teeth. Maybe I learned that lesson too well. Maybe he forgot I was listening. I did not sleep that night. I organized what little I owned, printed fragments of logs, my original discharge papers, the letter, and one photograph. I rarely looked at a grainy capture of our unit, taken in Cabell, Pierce in the center. My hand rested on the shoulder of Private Dawson, the soldier who never made it home. As I gathered these things, something shifted inside me. I realized I was no longer reacting to the past. I was assembling a weapon, not of bullets, but of memory. Some stories are not told, they are unleashed. If you are still here, you know this already. The past never stays buried, not when it remembers your name, and mine had just spoken. I left Texas before dawn, the horizon still holding tonight like it wasn't ready to let go. I didn't leave a note at the garage. There was no one who would have asked why. I had spent 4 years living in a place where people respected silence because they carried their own. It felt almost like betrayal, abandoning the one place that asked nothing of me. But there are debts a quiet life cannot pay. The road stretched east, long and unbroken, cutting through scrubland and abandoned gas stations where flags still waved out of habit rather than patriotism. With every mile, I felt the weight of the hard drive in my pack, not physically, but as something heavier, something alive, evidence, yes, but also a boundary. Once opened, there would be no retreat into anonymity. I would have to face the kind of truth that doesn't redeem, only reveals. I kept the radio off. Soldiers learn to live without noise. Pain does not require a soundtrack. Instead, I recited details in my mind over and over like rosary beads. Pierce, Echo File, 9 men died in Jalalabad. Article 18A, my own ID string buried in a breach I never made. Every fact was a wound I refused to let scar. Outside Wichita Falls, I stopped at a rest area and walked along the tree line, stretching legs stiff from hours of driving. A bus had pulled in, carrying uniformed recruits. Fresh haircuts, eyes still bright with belief. They stood in a loose formation, joking, half proud, half anxious. One of them looked at me, almost nodding in recognition before remembering I wore no insignia. He didn't know me, not really. Still, something in his gaze lingered, like a man spotting his future across a battlefield. I turned away before doubt could follow me back to the car. By the time I crossed into Virginia, rain had started, not violent. Relentless, the kind that crawls across windows like fingers, determined to seep through any weakness. I checked into a roadside motel under a name I had used before Ray's. No one questions a woman traveling alone if she pays cash and carries no questions in her eyes. That night, I laid out every document on the motel desk: the hard drive, the logs, my discharge notice, creased from years of being folded and refolded without purpose. Each item represented a version of me other people had written: captain, traitor, civilian, ghost. The one page missing from that table was my own account. I had never written it, never spoke it, not because I lacked words, but because I lacked the right to speak to them. That right had been taken, so I made myself a quiet promise. If I was to walk back into their world, I would no longer ask for the right to speak. I would take it. In the morning, I drove toward D.C., passing landmarks that once meant something to me. Arlington, where my father lay beneath precise white stone. The Pentagon, a fortress of geometry and ghosts. I did not stop. I was not ready to walk among the honored when my name remained cursed. My first destination was neither military nor political. It was human. Sergeant First Class O'Neill had retired just months after my discharge. Rumor said he had resigned his pension early, moved to a smaller town, and rarely spoke of the past. He had once told me that some truths are too big to fit inside testimony, that silence in the right hands can be protested. He lived beyond the city in a clapboard house with a sagging porch and wind chimes made from spent shell casings. I recognized his gait before he reached the door steady, though one knee dragged from an old parachute injury. He opened the screen and looked at me without surprise. "I was wondering when you'd arrive," he said. We stood in the doorway, two people holding something heavier than forgiveness. He motioned me inside. The living room was clean but sparse. A folded flag on the mantel, a wall with no medals, a crucifix cracked at one corner. "You kept it," I said, nodding toward the flag. He sat heavily, exhaling. "Some things stay even when names don't." I placed the hard drive on the table between us. He did not touch it, but his eyes settled on it as one might look at an unburied mine. "It wasn't supposed to reach you," he said softly. "Not like this." "You knew," I replied. "I suspected." But suspecting is not knowing, and knowing can kill. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for a coffee mug, though the cup was empty. I asked him the question that had followed me since exile. "Why didn't you speak up?" He closed his eyes. "Maria, I watched what they did to you. You were erased, not punished, not tried, erased. That is a fate worse than death for someone in uniform. And if they could do that to an officer, what do you think they would do to a sergeant with a bad knee and a family?" He wasn't just afraid, he was protecting his wife, his two daughters, the mortgage. "The truth is, they do not have to threaten your life to control you. They only have to threaten the lives you love." I leaned back. The wound I carried was mine. He was a different kind. Cowardice is a word used by those who do not understand survival. Before I left, he placed something in my hand, a rosary, combat-worn, the beads darkened with sweat and powder. "You'll need this," he said, "not for prayer, for remembering what mercy feels like." Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air raw. I placed the rosary in my coat pocket. Not faith, as a witness. My next confrontation would not be with a comrade, it would be with the institution itself. I drove toward Arlington, not to visit my father, not yet. I went to the administration wing where classified personnel boards are kept, a place I once walked freely, badge swinging against my chest. They would not let me pass the foyer. The woman at the desk looked up as I approached. Her expression told me she recognized something in my bearing. "If not my name, may I help you?" I looked at the directory on the wall, a list of offices: Department of Military Records, Legal Affairs, Public Integrity Tribunal. "Do you have business with a specific department?" she asked. I met her gaze. "No, I have unfinished business with all of them." She stiffened. I did not raise my voice. I did not threaten, but conviction unsettles even the unaware. They can lock files, bury evidence, and burn testimony. But there is one place even institutions cannot hide: memory, and I had just stepped back inside theirs. If you're still listening, you know this much is true. Some ghosts do not haunt halls, they knock on doors, and I had begun knocking again. Washington carries a particular kind of cold, the kind that slips through coat seams and lingers in the bones, as if the air itself remembers every oath sworn and broken within its borders. I felt it the moment I crossed the Potomac, even with the heater running in my truck. The last time I had driven this route, I wore a uniform and carried clearance badges. This time I brought only a hard drive, an old injury in my knee that still tightened in the cold, and a name that did not open doors anymore. I had not come back for reconciliation. I had come to confront the questions that refused to stay buried. St. Brigid's Chapel stood as it always had, a stone sentinel tucked between aging government buildings. I parked 3 blocks away, keeping to habit, scanning reflections in windows around me. My knee ached as I walked, not enough to weaken me, but enough to remind me that pain is a more trustworthy witness than memory. Inside, the sanctuary glowed with dim amber light filtering through stained glass. I had once attended memorial services here for soldiers whose names were etched into plaques along the wall. Men I had trained, men I had briefed, men I had failed to bring home. Father Mitchell sat near the front, hands folded loosely, not in prayer but in rest. He did not turn when I approached. His voice broke the silence as if we were continuing a conversation paused years ago. "You kept your silence longer than most could bear." I slid into the pew beside him. I did not return, I answered. The silence followed me. His eyes met mine then, weary but unflinching. "That is the nature of silence, Maria. It is never empty, it waits." I told him about the letter. Echo file. His posture barely changed, but something in his gaze tightened. He reached into his coat and handed me a folded slip of paper. "I received this 3 days ago. It had no name. I believed it was meant for you. I unfolded it. You are not alone, but they are watching." I studied the handwriting, compressed, urgent, not a threat, a warning. A breath slipped through my teeth. "Fear is a language," I said quietly. "Whoever wrote this speaks it fluently." He nodded. "They fear you more than they hate you. Hatred has purpose. Fear has instinct. And instinct is unpredictable." I asked him one question. "What do you know?" He looked at the crucifix above the altar rather than at me. "I know the official record of your case was sealed without counsel, that no tribunal convened, that 9 men died and no investigation followed. I know doors closed too quickly for it to be incompetence. I know truth was not lost, it was locked." Then he turned back to me. "But I do not know if you are ready to carry what lies behind that lock." I stood. "Destruction does not concern me, Father, only silence." He did not bless me when I left. Some paths have no rights. Outside, morning fog had thickened, muting the city in pale gray. That was when I saw it. A sedan parked across the street, windows blackened, engine idling, too still, too patient, watching, not waiting. They did not follow immediately. They wanted me to notice. Surveillance is communication. We see you, we remember. I walked calmly to my truck, shoulders steady, breath even. I drove without hurry, letting them settle into a distance I could control. 2 turns, 3, then I led them out of the city. I took Route 654 south, past industrial lots and silent rail yards. The fog thickened, clinging low over the ground like smoke that refused to lift. Their headlights flickered behind me, unwavering. I did not speed. Predators expect panic. I waited until we reached the stretch where the road thins to gravel and pine. There, I cut my lights and veered sharply onto an old maintenance path. My tires crunched frost as I slid to a stop behind an abandoned signal shack. I slipped out the passenger side and let the fog swallow me whole. The sedan crawled past moments later, headlights slicing through mist. They did not stop. They did not reverse. They were not hunters. They were shadows sent to confirm that I was moving, which meant someone had already begun preparing to stop me. I remained hidden until the sound of their engine faded. Only then did I move toward the rail yard ahead, boots whispering against frozen dirt. Freight cars slept in rows, tagged with rust and graffiti, relics of cargo long forgotten. I climbed into an empty container, pulled the door just enough to mask my figure, and opened the hard drive Duke had partially unlocked. The video flickered to life, grainy, desaturated. A meeting room with bare walls and a single hanging bulb. 2 men stood partially obscured. One of them I recognized even before his face turned, before his voice emerged. General Alan Pierce, my former commanding officer. The man who once pinned a commendation to my chest and later signed an order that cast me out. He spoke to someone off camera. A voice answered, low, heavy with an accent I could not place perfectly. Russian, I suspected, or Georgian. Pierce's reply was unmistakably clear. "He's handled. Keep the scapegoat quiet." The container walls seemed to lean inward. I replayed the line until it etched itself into marrow. Keep the scapegoat quiet, not eliminate, not expose. Silence. They had not wanted a conviction. They wanted an erasure. I closed the file. Anger would have been easier, but what I felt was something colder, certainty. I had not been discarded, I had been repurposed. My disgrace was not a consequence, it was a tactic. I withdrew a separate drive from my jacket and transferred the clip. Evidence is only as powerful as its redundancy. Then I reached for the only network I still trusted, not the government, not the press. The ones who live between those lines. Veteran Frontline, a decentralized network of former service members who document corruption, buried tribunals, denied benefits, disappeared cases. They do not take oaths, they keep receipts. I logged into an encrypted channel we used overseas to share coded tracers. I did not send my name, only a message. I have a fragment of what took 9 lives, seeking the rest. 4 hours later, the response came, prove your claim. I smiled without warmth. They were soldiers, proof before allegiance. I drove north through the night toward Fort Belvoir, where decommissioned data servers are stored before permanent destruction. I had once overseen a transfer there. Most believe data dies when a system shuts down. They are wrong. Data lingers like ghosts. Snow began to fall as I approached the perimeter, flakes spiraling in the glow of sodium lights. No guards stood watch at the main entrance. Too obvious, the real surveillance was housed behind glass in monitors in men sipping black coffee 2 buildings away. I parked off-site, checked for aerial drones, and approached on foot, hugging shadows. My knee protested the cold, stiffening slightly, but I had learned to fold pain into movement. It no longer hindered, it reminded. At the eastern utility gate, I located the gap I remembered from years past, a breach in the motion grid caused by bad calibration. Arrogance masquerading as oversight, I slipped through. Inside, the corridors pulsed with fluorescent lightning that flickered intermittently, strobes revealing empty halls like flashes from a war zone. I moved towards sublevel C, where archived intelligence data was held before transfer to Deep Vault. The air cooled as I descended, machines humming below like mechanical heartbeats. The server room was as I remembered it, rows of black towers, indicator lights blinking in a synchronous unison. I approached Terminal 17. An access point retained for system integrity scans. It still bore the same login scheme I had once implemented during audit protocols. Familiar, but compromised, a warning flashed at the corner of the screen. Remote session active. User ID Pierce AG. My reflection stared back at me in the monitor. Not startled, confirmed. He was here not physically, digitally, extracting or erasing. Either way, he had returned to finish what was started. I bypassed his session and initiated a mirror capture. If he was deleting, I would echo. If he was hiding, I would unveil. The system buckled under dual retrieval, processors whining. 39%. Bootsteps echoed from the stairwell. 47. A door opened somewhere beyond sight. 52. A voice filtered through the intercom. Controlled, measured. Find her. 63. I stood ready, not to flee, to confront. I had not come this far to remain unspoken. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was the reckoning. I moved through the tree line behind the facility until the last trace of artificial light faded behind me. My breath rose in slow clouds, controlled, careful not to reveal my position. The night pressed cold against my skin, and the ache in my knee sharpened with every step. The old injury had a rhythm of its own, pulsing like a heartbeat trapped in bone. I placed a hand against the trunk of a pine to steady myself and looked back only once. There was no chase. Not yet. They did not want to catch me in the open. They wanted to watch where I ran. I reached the abandoned way station just past the interstate overpass and slipped behind the rusted trailer beds. Only then did the tremors begin, faint but undeniable. The body remembers adrenaline long after the danger has passed. The burn scar on my forearm throbbed as I unwrapped the blood-stained gauze, a remnant of dragging Private Dawson through a wall of flame years ago in Cap. I pressed my thumb against the edge of that scar, grounding myself in something real. Pain is honest. Institutions are not. I removed the small USB drive from my boot lining and stared at it under the fractured moonlight. Inside that fragment lived the voice of General Pierce instructing a foreign operative to keep the scapegoat silent. I had carried many truths in my life. This was the first that felt like a loaded weapon. My case had never been about mistaken identity or procedural failure. It had been a transaction. Silence traded for survival. My survival always meant liability to them. I stayed hidden until the horizon turned the color of tarnished steel. I found an all-night diner 15 miles out, the kind where truckers nursed coffee and stared at road maps they no longer needed. I chose a booth in the corner, back to the wall. An old waitress with tired eyes poured coffee without asking questions. I wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the heat bleed into my palms, thawing the stiffness in my fingers. The knee throbbed beneath the table, each pulse a reminder of the blast that had torn through our convoy in Helmand. No metal had been marked that day, only this limp. I connected to a secure network through a burner device and reached out to veteran frontline. I did not send greetings or formalities. I sent the recording, the clip of Pierce, the mirrored terminal log of his remote access, proof that someone with authority had rewritten history, proof that my erasure had been engineered. The reply came hours later as I sat through 2 cups of burnt coffee and a plate of eggs grown cold. It did not arrive as text. It arrived as a voice wrapped in distortion. Female, calm, hardened. This is bigger than your case. I closed my eyes. I had expected doubt. I had expected dismissal, but this was worse. It meant confirmation. I typed my response in a single line. I am not here to clear my name. I am here to expose theirs. The reply came quickly. The rest of Echo Phase 2 will name the others. Without it, they will sacrifice Pierce and seal the wound. They will call it contained. I leaned back, so that was the truth. Pierce was not infected. He was the symptom. The waitress approached to refill my cup. You look like someone who has been awake longer than the sun. I managed a half smile. It has been a long night. She nodded as if she recognized something beyond fatigue. People who carry invisible weight often see it in others. She left without speaking another word. Outside, the air had warmed slightly, but the pressure in my knee persisted. I walked with a steady gait, not hiding the limp, but mastering it. Weakness is not always a liability. Sometimes it is proof of endurance. I reached my truck and opened my duffel. I removed the rosary O'Neill had given me. The beads were worn, stained from years of combat sweat. I rolled them once between my fingers. I did not pray, I remembered. Names, faces, laughter intense, blood on sand, the echo of 9 men whose deaths had been used to write my disgrace. I drove east, away from highways, toward the wooded backroads that stretched like arteries between forgotten towns. I needed to disappear until I was ready to reemerge on my own terms. They expected desperation. They expected recklessness. They had forgotten one simple truth. You cannot predict someone you never bothered to understand. I stopped at a roadside clearing to rest. I did not sleep. I cataloged the next steps. To retrieve the full Echo file Phase 2, I would need access to one of 2 locations, the original server cluster at Fort Meade or the Black Archive vault beneath Arlington. Meade was a fortress. Arlington was a tomb. I would need a way inside neither as a soldier nor citizen, but as something between, a ghost. Night settled again by the time I reached the outskirts of a decommissioned logistics depot near Manassas. I knew the location well. It was where field records went to wait for destruction. It was also where I had once hidden copies of decrypted field logs in a place no civilian would search. I parked a mile out and traveled on foot, moving through tall winter grass. The sky was empty, no stars, just a void stretching wide. I reached the perimeter fence. My fingers brushed metal, cold bit through my gloves. I paused, listening. The silence was perfect, too perfect. Electronic silence, jammers. That meant classified relay stations were still active underground. Perfect. Where secrets live, so does access. I crossed through a gash in the fence and followed the loading bay route, counting steps, listening for patrol rhythm. No movement, no guards, only the hum of a hidden generator. I reached the rear annex where the old keycard station sat rusted. I pried the panel open, wires insulated by time and neglect. I bypassed the lock with a contact probe. And the latch clicked. Doors built to withstand assault often fall to neglect. Inside, dust coated the air. I located the condemned records unit, shelves filled with discarded files, burned edges, half-shredded reports. Among them a narrow steel drawer with a marker I had carved myself years before, an X across the corner. I pulled it open. There it was, a backup capsule, a small encrypted tablet, original field sync unit from my deployment cycle. I had saved it before the inquiry, insurance, memory, or instinct. I held it now in both hands, feeling its weight like a heartbeat returned. I left without disturbance. No alarms followed me out. They had forgotten what they let decay. That had always been their mistake. Institutions remember procedures, not people. Back in the truck, I connected the tablet to the burner system. It powered on slowly, screen fractured but alive. The directory loaded. Echo File Phase 2 was there. Locked, isolated, divided into multiple cipher chains. It would take time to break, time I no longer had. I saved it to a drive separate from the first, 2 fragments, scattered truths, enough to wound, not enough to kill. I leaned back and closed my eyes. I felt the throb of my knee, the burn in my arm, scars mapping the cost of loyalty, and I whispered a promise into the empty cab. I am done being erased. I opened my eyes. The road ahead was endless, good. I had no intention of stopping. Those who built graves out of silence should learn one thing: some ghosts are not lost, they are returning. The morning broke with a colorless light that felt like paper against the skin. Veteran Frontline had already pushed the first fragment live at dawn, a clipped audio where a familiar voice instructed a foreign one to keep the scapegoat quiet. By 8, cable banners crawled with speculation. A senior official unnamed, a breach in the chain of custody, questions about Jalalabad that had never been answered. I watched from a motel room off Route 1 while steam rose from a cup of coffee I could not taste. The dog tag at my throat tapped once against my collarbone like a reminder to breathe. They would hold a briefing at 10. The Department of Defense would address rumors and reassert control, or try. I chose the gray vest because it felt like armor that did not pretend to be anything else. The black trench coat hid the lines of my shoulders and the tremor in my hand that still visited me after long nights. My knee ached in the cold like it had learned to predict storms. The burn scar on my forearm had settled to a dusky sheen. I covered it with a sleeve and told myself I would not use it the way some people use pain, as theater. It had been earned in heat and panic when a young man called Dawson could not move on his own. It belonged to both of us. The Pentagon lobby hummed with a swarm of press badges and whispered instructions. I entered without fanfare, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged until no one thought to stop me. Cameras perched on tripods like black birds waiting for a signal to descend. A line of officers in dress uniforms formed a vague wall at the edge of the stage, faces set to neutral, eyes scanning without really seeing. The seal hung behind the podium, heavy and impersonal. When I took a seat near the back, I felt a dozen glances slide across me and then away. To them, I was another anonymous body in a city that thrives on them. They started with statements. The designated spokesperson spoke in that measured cadence bureaucracies favor when they are nursing a bruise. He referenced ongoing internal reviews, unverified recordings, and a commitment to transparency. He did not use the word truth. He did not use my name. As questions rose like sparks, the doors at stage left opened, and a man stepped into view, silver hair neat, shoulders wide, the expression of someone who has spent a lifetime mastering rooms like this. General Alan Pierce walked to the podium as if drawn by a magnet that had always favored him. The murmurs sharpened to a single edge. I felt nothing for a few seconds. Then I felt the exact thing I had been waiting for, calm, the kind that arrives after a storm when you realize the damage is countable, the kind that lets you stand. I rose and began moving down the aisle, not rushed, not grand. I moved the way we moved toward the body of someone we used to know. Eyes slid toward me one by one. At first in irritation that anyone would dare block a shot. Then in the kind of recognition that cannot be named out loud. A woman in a tan blazer gasped and covered it with a cough. A cameraman paused over his shoulder. Across the front row, a colonel I had once served under went pale in a way that made his ribbons look like decals stuck to a different life. The first person to truly see me was not Pierce. It was a familiar face I had agreed to meet again. Major Ellis, now promoted and heavier. The man whose signature had written the paper that set my disgrace in motion. He had not expected me to be alive inside this room. His mouth opened, then closed, like a fish realizing the water around it has been replaced with air. He did not call out. He did not step forward. He simply clutched the folder in his hands as if paper could hold him up. I kept moving until I stood at the front, one step from the rope line that separated the audience from the stage. 2 security officers drifted toward me, uncertain whether I was a risk or an embarrassment. I met their eyes and did the one thing that confuses men trained to respond to aggression. I smiled. It was not kind, it was recognition. Then I slid the dog tag from beneath my shirt and laid it on the edge of the press table with a soft metallic click. The noise was nothing. The meaning was not. The room tightened, cameras recalibrated. The spokesperson faltered mid-sentence and glanced at Pierce. For a heartbeat, I watched a man weigh the cost of pretending he did not know me. Then he did what men like him always do. He chose control over truth. He addressed the room as if nothing had happened. He said that internal affairs had found irregularities that would be handled within appropriate channels. He said that any suggestion of foreign compromise was irresponsible. He said the department was united. He did not see the trap that had already sprung. Behind him, the screen warmed to life. Veteran Frontline had sent a second clip with a timestamp that matched a night I remembered for its silence. This clip was not the one I had recorded in the freight car. This one was longer. My breath synced with the rise of static, Pierce in profile, a room without windows. The other voice was roughened by cigarettes. Pierce said that the operator had been handled. The voice asked for confirmation. He answered that the access trail would lead to the perfect candidate. Then the name appeared on the screen in text pulled from metadata. Hayes. The room did not gasp. It seemed to lose air altogether. A man near the back shouted a question that dissolved into others. Chaos is what institutions fear most in public. It cannot be escorted out. It cannot be redacted. Pierce tried to speak above it, but the microphone betrayed him with a crackle that sounded like laughter. He turned then, perhaps to call for the feed to be cut, and saw me fully. There is a moment when someone recognizes both the past and the future in one face. I watched it land on him like cold iron. I did not need to be introduced. I did not ask permission. I stepped to the side where the rope line ended and the aisle met the platform stairs. The security officers reached out as if to block me, then lowered their hands when I did not move to climb. I did not need the stage to claim the room. I already had it. I addressed no one and everyone. I said that I had not come here to be absolved. I said that honor does not require an audience. I said that systems can erase names from files, but not from the mouths of the dead. I did not raise my voice. The microphones found me anyway. The spokesperson tried to pivot. He said that this venue was not appropriate for unverified personal statements. He said process. He said protocol. I looked at him long enough for the room to realize that I had seen men die under orders and that the word appropriate lands differently on those who carried them back. He stopped speaking. Major Ellis finally moved. He did not defend me. He did not denounce me. He whispered into the ear of a uniformed aide who then hurried toward the wings with the look of someone who knows which hallway to choose when a building begins to tilt. I watched his back and thought about signatures, how ink can carry a weight the hand never intended to hold. I let him go. There would be time to face him without cameras and without the excuse of orders. A reporter asked me if I could prove the recording was real. I said that proof was already living in their systems if they could bring themselves to dig where it hurts. I said that an active remote session bearing Pierce's credentials had been detected inside a classified archive the night before. My voice did not shake, not because I was fearless, but because I was finished with fear behaving like a virtue. Another clip rolled. This one was only 7 seconds long, enough to set a nail, Pierce saying that the payment had cleared. A string of numbers that could be read as a bank code if you knew what to look for. The image froze on his face, mouth half open like a man about to realize he has been standing on a trapdoor the entire time. The spokesperson stepped away from the podium and made a motion that read as coordination but smelled like panic. Security shifted toward the stage, not toward me. That told the room what mattered. I kept my eyes on Pierce. I thought of the heat in Kabul and the late night when he told a room full of young officers that loyalty is the highest discipline. I thought of how many of us believed him, how many of us wore that belief into places we did not come back from. I let the silence fill with the weight of those numbers. 9. Jalalabad, the ones whose families received folded flags and explanations that used words like unfortunate and unavoidable. The dog tag on the table caught the light. A camera zoomed in. The image flashed across monitors and phones like a heartbeat amplified. Someone somewhere watching at home told someone else to come see. Mothers and fathers and wives and brothers who know the shape of a dog tag from across a room changed the channel and turned up the sound. They did not need context. They understood that metal around a neck means that a person once promised to stand between danger and those who could not. They understood that you do not place that metal where the world can see unless it is time to remember what a promise costs. I moved one step closer to the rope line and touched my fingertip to the burn scar beneath my sleeve, out of sight but present. A small private ritual, not for the cameras, for myself. I felt the line of it under the fabric like the seam of an old map leading back to the person I had been before a stamp, and a silence tried to replace her. Then I lifted my chin so the room would not miss the lesson I had learned in exile. You can strip a soldier of rank and command, you can burn a file and seal a record, but you cannot take from her the right to speak her own name. I told them that the rest of Echo File Phase 2 existed, and that pieces were already safe in places that did not answer to a single department. I told them that this was not about a single general or a single night. I told them it was about a pattern of convenience that becomes policy when no one is looking. A murmur rose that felt different from the press frenzy. It sounded like recognition. It sounded like a room beginning to understand that it had been part of a silence. Pierce tried again. He said that I was unstable. He said that I had fabricated evidence to mask my own guilt. He reached for a word I have seen used like a blade against women who refuse to be quiet. He did not get to finish it. The screen behind him flickered and a new image appeared, not audio. Ledger entries, dates, amounts, transfers routed through cutouts that would take a long time to untangle in public but only seconds to tear open inside the right office. A reporter with quicker eyes than the rest called out a date that matched the night I had been taken from my room and told to be quiet in a way that made my ears ring for days. The math began to do its work. You could feel the balance shift without anyone moving. The officers at the edge of the stage straighten the way men do when they realize they are standing next to a collapse that might land on them. The spokesperson stepped back and put both hands behind his back as if to remind himself he still had a body. The cameras pulled tighter and tighter until all you could see were faces. Mine, his, the ones in the front row who had made their peace with obedience long ago and were now recalculating whether that peace had ever truly belonged to them. I said one more thing because rooms like this forget unless you say it out loud. I said that I did not come to claim victory. I said that justice does not win in places like this. It survives one more day. If you are listening, let me tell you that day is enough to open the next door. The first move toward Pierce was not dramatic. An officer in plain clothes approached from stage right and spoke into his ear. Pierce nodded once, sharply. The way a man nods when he has been offered a choice and knows there is not one. The officer took his arm. Another stepped in on the other side. The microphones picked up nothing but the soft static that follows a decision. The room did not cheer. It did not boo. It did the most American thing a room can do when it witnesses a reckoning. It went quiet so that the sound of handcuffs could be heard. Metal closed around wrists that had signed more orders than I could count. For a second, I thought of my own wrists that night years ago and the way the cuffs had felt more like an absence than a restraint. I did not enjoy the symmetry. I respected it. The rope line between us felt less like a boundary and more like a measured distance I had chosen to keep. I stepped back as they led him away, not because I feared anything, but because I knew this part was not mine. Arrests belong to the state. Truth belongs to those who fought for it. I gathered the dog tag from the table and slid it back beneath my shirt where it had always rested. The metal was cool. The weight was right. My knee reminded me that I was still a body moving through a world that had tried to forget I existed. The ache steadied my gait. I turned away from the stage and walked up the aisle past faces that would never again pretend not to see me. Near the doors, I passed Major Ellis. He did not look at me. He studied the floor as if the answers had been spilled there and he might mop them up before they stained. I paused beside him long enough for him to feel the presence of the person his pen had helped bury. I said quietly that there is still time to speak. He flinched as if language were a bullet. He did not reply. I left him to his silence. It belonged to him now, not to me. Outside, winter light cut across the parking circle and threw long shadows over the stone. Reporters flooded the steps like a tide. A few shouted questions about what would happen next. I did not stop. I lifted my chin and let the cameras catch whatever they needed. Inside my chest, something that had been locked for 4 years moved. Not closure, not triumph, motion. The kind you feel when a heavy door finally gives and you can push it open with your shoulder and step through. As I reached the street, my phone vibrated once against my palm. A message from Veteran Frontline, only 5 words. The network is larger than him. I closed my eyes and let the truth of it settle. Duty and truth had finally met in the same room. They had not shaken hands. They had simply agreed to see each other again. If you are still here, keep with me. The battle you just watched does not end a war. It opens one that can finally be fought in daylight. The first sound outside the Pentagon was not sirens or orders. It was the electric hiss of cameras warming into a frenzy. Reporters surged forward in a tide that broke against the stone steps and curled back again, each wave louder than the last. Headlines flashed across phones like flares in a night sky. Senior general detained, possible foreign contact, new evidence in Jalalabad case. A boom mic grazed my shoulder, and a woman shouted a question that dissolved under the weight of 20 more. I kept walking. Justice never arrives to applause. It only survives the noise. Traffic on the circle had halted. Drivers leaned out of windows with the hollow faces of people who sense history moving past them and do not yet know which way to look. The winter light had shifted into a hard white that made every edge appear sharper. I moved along the perimeter fence to a quieter curb and let the chaos pool without me. My knee throbbed with the rhythm of a drum underground. The burn scar along my forearm prickled beneath my sleeve as if it could smell the heat of old fires. A young cameraman jogged up and asked how it felt. I told him feelings were for later. Today was for breath. Phones buzzed against palms all around me. With each vibration, the story grew teeth. A live stream announced that a second clip had been released. Metadata matching a night I remembered by the silence that followed it. Ledger lines, dates, numbers that form ladders for prosecutors to climb. A woman near me lowered her phone and pressed a hand to her mouth. She whispered that her brother served in Jalalabad. She did not finish the sentence. I nodded once. There are conversations you learn to complete without words. A private sedan pulled to the curb, and a man in an agency suit reached for my elbow. He said the department had a quiet room where I could rest. He said they would keep the press at bay. He said I was safer with them. I studied his eyes for the telltale tremor of someone asked to carry a story heavier than his title. Then I told him I would walk. Safety has many rooms. Mine has a door I can open from the inside. I cut down a side street where the air was thinner and the buildings leaned close as if they wanted to listen. The city smelled like cold stone and crowded ambition, the way Washington always does when it is pretending not to fear its own reflection. At the corner, I paused and leaned against a light pole while a bus roared past. Inside it, faces flickered behind fogged glass. A woman saw me and lifted 2 fingers from her seat in a gesture that might have been a salute or a blessing. I felt the dog tag against my throat and let it steady my breathing. Veteran Frontline reached me as a single notification that brightened my screen and then dimmed. The message said the network extends beyond Pierce. The patterns match older incidents. Your fragment opened a lock. More doors are moving. I wrote back while walking. I said I was prepared for doors that fight back. They answered with a map coordinate and 3 words that tasted like iron. Phase 3 active. The phrase reached down through 4 years and touched the place where I had hidden my rage so it could not burn me alive. Phase 3 was not a policy. It was a tactic. When an operation is threatened, move assets, eliminate variables, cleanse records, rewrite blame. I had been a variable once. Erased. Not tried, now the variable was moving toward me again with a different shape and a colder face. I crossed to the river path and followed the water south where the city thins into government lots and bare trees. Wind tore at my coat and slipped under the edges of my vest, but I let the chill do its work. Clarity requires clean air. I sat on a bench that faced the Potomac and counted my pulse the way I learned to during field ops. 5 counts in, 5 counts out. The ache in my knee found a dull harmony and quieted to a manageable hum. A runner slowed as he passed and asked if I was all right. I told him I was collecting myself. He nodded with the simple respect soldiers give one another without asking for proof. Footsteps approached on gravel, not hurried, not hesitant. That tempo belongs to someone who has decided to find you and already regrets it. I did not turn. The man stopped 2 steps behind my shoulder and said my name as if it might shatter in the air. I knew the voice, Major Ellis. I had seen him fold into himself in the briefing room when I laid the dog tag on the table. He sat on the far end of the bench without looking at me and said that the building was burning from the inside. He spoke in a low, even tone that sounded like a confession delivered to a wall. He said internal channels were seizing. He said that he had followed orders and that those orders had measured me as a liability rather than a person. He said the word regret, and it fell between us like a coin that had lost its value. I told him that silence has a body count and that it includes the living. He closed his eyes and said he knew. Then he said something I did not expect. Pierce is not the end. There is a liaison buried in procurement who touched the transfers. He did not know a name. He knew a pattern. He slid a folded sheet toward me without making contact. He stood. He said he was ready to answer questions under oath. He did not ask me for forgiveness. It was the first honest choice I had ever seen him make. I did not read the paper right away. I watched the river and let my mind move like the current, past rocks and sunken branches toward open water. When I finally unfolded the page, I found a set of abbreviated aliases attached to contract numbers that would look boring to anyone who has never watched money move like a weapon. A single letter marked each entry. S, 13 instances across 18 months. I memorized the sequence and put the paper away. I told myself that S was not a letter, it was a door. I walked until evening pulled color out of the sky and left it bluish and thin. The city had shifted into its nocturne. Office windows dimmed, patrol cars glided, restaurant lights woke. I reached a chapel that had once held my grief and stepped inside. The sanctuary smelled like old wood and clean dust. I slid into a back pew and let my shoulders fall. Father Mitchell appeared from a side door and did not pretend to be surprised. He said he had watched the briefing on a small television in the sacristy and that silence had finally been forced to take a breath. I told him a breath was not a cure. He smiled sadly and said cures are for illness. This is a wound. The scar becomes the lesson. We sat for a long time without speaking. The chapel settled around us like a blanket pulled up to a chin. When I rose to leave, he pressed a small object into my hand, a simple wooden cross on a thin cord. He said, carry it if you want, or do not. It is not a command, it is a companion. I slipped it into my pocket beside the lighter I carry for Dawson. Fire and wood, weight and warmth. Back on the street, my phone trembled again. Veteran Frontline had sent another file. A partial ledger reconstruction that pointed past Pierce into a private contracting firm with a patriotic name and a hollow center. The alias S appeared again alongside micro-transfers carved into training budgets and cybersecurity audits. A whisper trail. I wrote that I would need deeper access. They replied with a time and a location where a contact could pass me a key. A key can be a token or a man. Tonight it would be both. The handoff took place in the underground level of a federal parking structure that smelled of exhaust and cold concrete. I walked down the ramp with the steady pace of someone who knows who they are and what they came for. A woman waited near a maintenance door in a coat too thin for the temperature. Her face held the fatigue of a decade spent inside rooms that steal sleep. She pressed a small card into my palm and said 3 words, "Do not call me." Then she left without asking if I was the person she believed me to be. Trust is not always a handshake. Sometimes it is a refusal to linger. The card unlocked a secure archive portal that would normally require months of paperwork and a sponsor who owes you their life. I went back to my motel and set up a clean environment that would leave no footprints where a hunter could track them. I connected, authenticated, and entered a vault where the air feels so still you can hear your heart in your teeth. The index is unspooled like a fiber optic river. I searched against the alias S and found a shell account nested under a standard compliance folder. It was not elegant, it was arrogant. People who confuse secrecy with safety make that mistake. Inside the shell, I discovered what Phase 3 often hides: travel authorizations for unnamed personnel. Service contracts modified at midnight, a briefing schedule that did not go through normal channels. One name appeared twice beside all of them, not Pierce, someone above procurement, a deputy for operations integration. The kind of title that means everything and nothing. The records confirmed something else the public would not yet know. An emergency interagency meeting had been scheduled for the morning to discuss containment. My name did not appear on the agenda. That made me smile for the first time in days. You cannot erase what you did not account for. I saved what I could to 2 separate drives and then burned the session to ash. The motel room returned to its old humming quiet. The bedspread smelled like bleach and thyme. I sat at the small table and wrapped new gauze over the burn scar that had reopened on the fence. The skin throbbed beneath the bandage in a steady pulse that matched the ache in my knee. I welcomed both. They keep me inside my body when the world tries to turn me into a theme. I ate a sandwich from a vending machine and considered the path ahead. Part of me wanted to lie down and let sleep take a long claim. Another part, the part that kept me alive when the door opened at 2 in the morning 4 years ago, insisted that rest comes after you pass the baton to the next runner. I sent a packet of the new findings to Veteran Frontline with a note that said the board is bigger. They replied in a minute. We will go public at dawn. We advise you to move. Phase 3 includes you. I cleaned the room so that a stranger could not read my life in the crumbs. I packed my duffel and slid the drives into the false bottom I had cut when I still believed I might never use it. I checked the parking lot from the curtain and saw only the lazy churn of late-night traffic. I took the stairs without touching the rail. On the landing, I stopped and listened the way I used to in compounds overseas. Hum of ice machine. Clack of a distant door. No breath where breath should not be. I went out at night. The air tasted metallic. Snow threatened the smell. I walked past my truck and kept going until I reached a side street where a row of cars sat with the quiet posture of animals sleeping in a field. I chose one that could swallow a different life and drove until the city thinned to shadows and highway lights. Somewhere behind me, phones rang in offices that had not expected to wake so early. Somewhere ahead of me, a door waited with the letter S scratched on the inside casing where only a careful hand could find it. If you are listening, remember this part. They thought the story ended when a man in stars was led from a stage in cuffs. They thought I had spent everything in one room. They did not understand the arithmetic of duty. Justice does not win. It outlasts. It leans forward into the next hour and says, try again. I drove until the sky began to pale in a thin line along the horizon. The dog tag rested warm against my skin as if the metal had learned my temperature. I touched the cross in my pocket and the lighter beside it, wood and fire, memory and spark. I whispered a promise I could keep. If justice survives one more day, I will walk one more mile. The road answered by unfolding. The night let go, and somewhere in the buildings I had left behind. A new lock slid into place while another loosened, as if the city itself had decided to blink. The news landed the way winter rain lands on stone. Quiet at first, then everywhere at once. A federal court read the verdict that the country had waited to pretend it did not expect. General Alan Pierce, guilty of treason. The television anchors used voices meant for funerals and holidays, the kind that slow down time so viewers can feel informed and safe without being asked to understand. I watched from a chair that leaned a little too far back in a government waiting room that did not offer coffee to the uninvited. When the gavel fell, the cameras cut to the courthouse steps, where microphones trembled in cold wind and strangers spoke about accountability. No one said my name. That felt accurate. An aide in a navy suit handed me a large envelope with a practiced smile that did not reach his eyes. Inside was a certificate on thick paper that smelled faintly of ink and apology withheld. The language climbed and circled like a runner who is very proud to be moving without going anywhere. Restoration of rank in good standing. Record amended. Determination of honorable service. The letter never said the word sorry. It did not mention my mother who died believing her daughter was a disgrace, or the 4 years of work done in the dark under a name that did not belong to me. It simply welcomed me back to a place I had learned to live without. I slid the paper back into the envelope and thanked the aide for nothing specific. He looked relieved, as if I had just disarmed a small bomb that he had been asked to carry across a crowded room. Reporters tried to angle for a reaction outside, the way they always do when a story is ready to end, and the person in the frame refuses to give them a last sentence to hang it on. I kept my coat closed and my head level. A woman with a scarf the color of a clean bruise asked how it felt to have my honor returned. I told her that honor cannot be returned because it is not a library book. It is a life you keep paying for. She blinked like a person stepping from a warm house into a cold morning. Someone behind her wrote down the word paying and underlined it twice. I walked away before they could turn it into a slogan. The flight to Texas was uneventful in the way a healing wound is uneventful. Nothing new happens. Only the old pain gathers and settles in its familiar place. I watched the map crawl west, the line crossing over towns where I had once slept in rented rooms and small barracks, counting breaths so that panic would not learn my schedule. The man beside me fell asleep with his mouth open and his hands folded like he was praying to forget. The flight attendant offered water and called me Mom in a voice that sounded like she had eaten gravel for breakfast. When the plane descended over the desert, I pressed my burned forearm against the window and let the warmth come through the glass. The scar brightened, then cooled. The knee did its steady drumbeat under the tray table, a rhythm I knew better than any anthem. I drove south from the airport on a frontage road that curled like a question mark through scrub and shadow. The sky had that particular Texas clarity that makes distances look like promises. I passed the garage where I used to work under a different name. The one the locals called the Ghost Captain, because I kept my head down and my hands busy. The door was rolled up and the old radio inside was arguing with a preacher about weekend football. I did not stop. Some doors must be left closed when you are still the person who once hid behind them. The memorial sits on a rise east of town where the wind gets a clean run across the flat and the sun finds everything without effort. 9 stones in a crescent. Names cut into granite that will last longer than any war story told at a bar. The ground keeps a thin cover of native grass that knows how to live with heat and patience. I parked at the bottom of the slope and walked up slowly, each step measured so pain could not hurry me. The dog tag at my neck tapped once against my collarbone, then again. It had done that on long marches and longer nights. It is a metronome for the part of the heart that refuses to quit. I stood in front of the stones and said each name aloud. I did not ask the air to carry the words anywhere. I wanted the sound to settle right where I stood. Dawson first, because Burns remembered their maker, then the others in the order in which I had learned they were gone. The sequence never leaves you once it has been forced into your body. The light shifted across the granite so that certain letters glowed and others rested. I placed my palm against each stone until my hand cooled. When I reached the last one, I took the dog tag from my neck and held it until the chain warmed my fist. I set it at the base of the middle stone and stepped back. I told them that I had been given a certificate saying I was welcome again among the people who decide such things. I told them that the paper felt heavy and small at the same time. I told them that no one said sorry and that I did not need it because sorry is a currency that buys nothing. I told them that I had believed as a young lieutenant that honor was the ribbon you earned and the rank you wore and the salute you returned. I told them that I had learned in the last 4 years that honor is the thing you protect when there is nothing left to stand on but your own feet. The wind lifted and laid my hair against my cheek like a hand. I did not cry. The desert is not a place that encourages weeping. It prefers honesty. People leave things at memorials because the living need to put weight on the ground when words fail. Coins, patches, photos curled at the edges. I left my tag because I no longer wanted a circle of metal to remind me who I was. I wanted the 9 to hold it. I wanted them to know that if anyone ever came to that rise and asked where Maria Hayes had gone, the answer would be right there in plain sight. She is with the ones who did not come home. She is also the one who kept walking. Sometimes the body reaches understanding faster than the mind. When I turned to go, my knee went soft in a way that told me it had just learned a new fact about weight. I steadied myself and breathed in the dry sweetness that comes off mesquite when the sun has been on it all day. Below the hill, a pickup had pulled over to the side of the road. The door opened, then closed. A man climbed the slope like someone who had counted the steps in his head before he began. Duke has a way of moving like he is listening for a sound no one else can hear. He stopped 3 paces away and waited until my breathing matched the wind. Then he nodded once, the way men do when they have brought something heavy and do not want to drop it. He held a small drive in his palm, the kind that looks like it cannot possibly hold anything important, which is exactly why it does. He said there was a thing I needed to see, and that he had not wanted to send it because screens are not the right place for certain truths. His voice was roughened by long nights and abuse of coffee, but it carried a careful respect that is different from pity. He told me that the first log in the sequence was not what we had been led to believe. He said the initial access did not belong to Pierce. He said a name that I have carried since childhood like a stone in the mouth. Hayes. He looked past me at the stones and then back, waiting for me to tell him to leave. I did not. I held out my hand. The drive sat in my palm like a small black confession. We did not move for a few long heartbeats. I thought of the chapel in Washington and the wooden cross in my pocket. I thought of the lighter for Dawson that no longer sparks but still warms when I squeeze it. I thought of the word reinstated and how it sounds like a door closing in reverse. I thought of the night 4 years ago when men came to my apartment and said that quiet was my only choice if I wanted to keep breathing. I thought of the freight car and the footage and the room with no windows. I thought of all of it arriving in a single line across the dry air between us. On the way back down the slope, Duke walked beside me but did not speak. He is a man who understands that commentary ruins certain moments. At the truck he asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes even though I did not. He poured from a thermos into a metal cap that tasted faintly of dust and fuel. The coffee was bitter in a way that told me he had not learned how to keep filters in a sealed bag. We stood facing the rise as the sun slid lower and turned the stones the color of old bone. In the distance, a train called to itself and then went silent. I felt the weight of the drive in my pocket as if it had decided to double its mass while I was not looking. In town, life behaved as if verdicts were television events that did not touch the price of bread or the ache of backs. A woman pushed a stroller past a store that had been closing for as long as I could remember. A group of teenagers laughed in that sharp way that cuts ties with childhood. A man in a straw hat carried a sack of feed on one shoulder and a box of nails in the other. I drove slowly through the familiar grid, stopping at lights even when there was no one coming, because obeying the small laws helps a person remember which big ones they will never bend again. The sky flared and then softened. I reached my rented house with its sagging porch and its honest walls and parked beneath the pecan tree that drops leaves like letters from someone who cannot spell. Inside, the air held the stale clean of a place left neat for an absence that lasted longer than planned. I set my keys in the bowl by the door and my coat on the chair and my hand on the table to make sure it was still there. Old habits returned in a polite line. Check the windows, check the back door. Check the floorboard by the stove where a carpenter missed a nail 20 years ago and left a soft spot that meets you with a small sigh. I filled a glass with water and drank half and let the other half warm to room temperature. Then I took the drive from my pocket and set it on the table beneath the lamp. I did not plug it in, not yet. The mind has to make room for certain things or they will roll around inside you and bruise everything they touch. I sat on the floor with my back against the cabinet so that the boards would steady me, and I let the dog tag absence cool the skin at my collarbone. I spoke aloud to the person I have become when no one is watching. I said that I knew what it meant if the first access belonged to Hayes with an M. I said that some operations require a mask so complete that even the mirror believes it is looking at a stranger. I said that the past has a way of reaching for the nearest throat when it wants to breathe again. I said that I was not afraid of what the file would say. I was afraid of what it would ask me to remember. The phone on the counter buzzed once like a cricket clearing its throat. A message from Veteran Frontline waited on the screen, short and without ceremony. The network is stabilizing. The case will not be closed with Pierce. Watch your 6. I typed a thank you that did not use the word thanks because that word wears thin when you have needed it too often. I told them I was safe for the moment. They replied that safe is a moving target. They were right. Night came fast and clean. Texas does not like to waste time on twilight. I turned on the porch light and listened to the insects tell each other about the dark. Somewhere down the block, a dog argued with a siren and then gave up. I took the wooden cross from my pocket and held it against the old burn until the skin remembered cool. I set it beside the lighter on the table, fire and wood reunited like a prayer that does not ask for anything. Then I picked up the drive. I am not a woman who believes that fate writes our lives in a handwriting we cannot read. I am a soldier who believes that choices have consequences that travel farther than any map can predict. I did not ask for a sign, I asked for strength. The kind that lets you sit with the truth long enough to do the next right thing. I slid the drive back into my pocket instead of the machine. Not yet. The dead were still awake on that hill. The paper still sat in that envelope like a small master trying to teach me gratitude. The city still carried my footsteps from this house to the memorial and back again. I would open the file at dawn when the world is honest. If justice is still breathing, I will move with it. If it sleeps, I will keep watch. In the morning, I will plug the drive into the machine I trust least and meet whatever name rises from the dark. Tonight, I will sit with the silence that has carried me farther than applause ever could. Tonight, I will remember that honor is not something returned to me on paper. It is the way I stand when no one is watching and the way I rise when the floor shifts under my feet. On the counter, the faucet ticked as pipes settled. Outside, a train called again. Softer this time, as if it had learned what the road already knew. The road goes on. I will go with it. And if tomorrow asks me to carry a heavier truth than today, I will lift it with both hands and let the weight teach me how to walk. Night in Texas has a way of telling the truth. It strips the color from the day and leaves only shape, sound, and the steady drum of your own heart. I sat at the kitchen table with the drive Duke had placed in my palm, the little black weight that carried a past I had not wanted but had always deserved. The house was quiet except for the low creak of boards and the dry tick of the porch light. I did not rush. A soldier knows that the last steps of a mission can break you if you try to finish them with adrenaline instead of care. I breathed until my hands were steady. I set the drive down and let my fingers rest on the table, as if wood could ground a mind that was already moving ahead. I powered up the old laptop I keep for work that requires distance. No pictures, no saved passwords, no name that could betray me if someone ever lifted its lid. The screen warmed and threw a soft square of light across the table. I could see the faint silver line of the burn scar on my forearm, a quiet path from a younger life through smoke and heat. The knee throbbed in its familiar cycle. I welcomed both. Pain is the honest archivist. It keeps what the world tries to erase. The file system recognized the drive. A directory appeared with 6 folders, each a short name that meant nothing to anyone who had not learned to read the handwriting of classified work. I opened the first and found a log with a date older than the Jalalabad ambush, older than my exile, old enough to have survived a purge designed by cowards with clean desks. Echo Origin, that was the label. Below it, a short line that carried my name without ceremony. Hayes M. Access granted. The time stamp landed with the weight of a hammer on steel. 6 years ago, I leaned back and felt the chair bow beneath me. The truth did not come as fire. It came as a blade dipped in water and laid gently against the skin. I read the memo I had written to myself in a voice I still recognized. Objective to draw out a mole through a decoy access path. Method to create a false credential footprint that looks like a field tech wandering outside her lane. Safeguards to isolate the decoy environment from operational systems. Secondary safeguard to burn the path if any hostile pattern emerges. The words were precise and cold, the way orders have to be when you want your people to live. I remembered the room where I wrote them. A concrete box with a humming unit and no windows. I remembered the smell of the coffee I did not drink and the taste of iron at the back of my throat. I had built a trap for the kind of man who smiles as he closes doors behind you. I had left the bait with my own initials and a lock only I could open. The plan had worked once. The mole took the path, and we followed the thread until it led to a man with clean hands and a phone that burned when he dropped it. Systems are like rivers. Once they learn a channel, they use it again. Somewhere between that room and the night the men came to my door at 2, someone had dredged my old decoy and turned it into a current that carried blame. They laid my initials over an access I never made. They taught a machine to speak in my cadence. They pulled my old lock from a dusty shelf and fitted it to a new door. I stared at my name on the screen and felt nothing for a long moment. Then I felt what I had waited to feel since the first time I saw the accusation. Not anger, not relief, understanding. The loop was complete. I had made the first circle, and the system had walked it back to me with a knife in its hand. I did not forgive myself and I did not condemn myself. Both would have been vanity. I did what soldiers do when they learn that their own work has been used against them. I inventoried the facts. I had designed Echo Origin to flush a traitor. The method had been clean and contained. Later, under different hands. In a different room, it had been expanded, dirtied, and aimed at me. None of that changed the shape of the truth. My name had been the first footprint on a path that led to 9 stones in a crescent. I pressed my palm against the table and let the weight of that land where it belonged. Not in guilt that cripples, in responsibility that clarifies. There was more in the folder. A short after-action note in my old style. Written at the end of a long night when I still believed a closed file meant a finished war. Risk noted. Future mitigation recommended. Establish routine audit of decoy paths to prevent reuse by hostile actors. A simple sentence, no signature. I closed my eyes and saw the young officer I had been, pacing the edge of a map with a pen in her hair, certain that good work would protect the people it touched. I opened my eyes and saw the room as it was. A table, a drive. A house that knew my footsteps. I deleted nothing. Records are the spine that keeps a life standing when memory wishes to bend. The phone buzzed on the counter. Veteran Frontline had sent a single line. New source confirms a handler above Pierce, codename Shepard. The message carried no decoration and no false urgency. They knew I would move. I wrote back with a time in my next city. They answered with a secure drop and a reminder that Phase 3 does not sleep. I smiled without humor. Neither do I. I shut the laptop and slid the drive into the pocket where a pulse can feel weight. I stood and crossed the room, checking the windows out of habit, not fear. The porch light through a cone on the steps. Moths worked the edge of it with the focus of saints. The neighborhood was dark except for the patient glow of kitchen lamps and the occasional flare of a cigarette drawn slow. My house held its silence like a promise. I walked to the bedroom and began to pack the way I had learned in places where every ounce mattered. Spare clothes rolled tight, medical kit, field notebook. A small photo of my mother that lives in a pocket without a frame. I did not reach for the dog tag. It belonged on the hill. I sat on the bed to lace my boots, and the knee spoke up with a familiar complaint. I answered the way I always do. Noted, we are going anyway. The burn scar tugged as the fabric slid down my forearm. I pressed 2 fingers along its length and felt the old heat that lives in the body long after ash is gone. Scars teach you how to carry time. They remind you that survival is not the same as escape. I finished packing and stood in the center of the room, listening. There is a way the air changes when you are about to cross a line you cannot recross. It grows thin and bright. It asks if you are sure. I was. Before I left, I drove back to the rise where the stones keep watch. The night had hollowed out the horizon and filled it with stars. The memorial looked smaller under a sky that large. Like a hand set gently on the earth, I stood where I had stood that afternoon and said a single sentence to the 9. I told them I had learned how the knife found me and that I would find the hand that guided it. I told them I did not need their forgiveness. I asked for their steadiness. The wind moved across the grass and did not answer, which is how soldiers speak when words are not useful. I touched the place where my tag rested and stepped back. On the road out of town, the traffic was light and the radio held its breath between stations. I turned it off and let the engine be enough. The highway gathered me in the way a river gathers a small branch and shows it where the current runs. The signs clicked past with their green promises of cities and miles. My phone vibrated again with coordinates and a time that would get me to a meeting before dawn. I pinned the map to memory and slid the device face down on the seat. I have relied on paper maps and the angle of a sun I could not see. I can still do it when I need to. Tonight I did not need to pretend the past was the only guide I had left. The line where sky meets earth began to lift its color, not sunrise yet, only the idea of it. The asphalt hummed under the tires, steady and low, a song for those who travel without permission. I thought about Shepherd and the tidy cruelty of a name like that. A shepherd is a guide, a guardian, a keeper of order. The person who wore that code name had perverted the word and hidden inside it. I wondered how many doors I would have to open before I found the one with a hinge strong enough to hold his weight. I wondered if my mother would have recognized the woman steering into the dark with empty neck and full pockets. I decided she would have. She had always believed that truth required travel. My mind tried to return to the line in the log that carried my name. I let it pass through without building a house around it. The trap had been mine. The weapon had not. I had learned that lesson the hardest way a person can learn anything, by watching people I loved pay for a decision that began with my pen. The only thing left was to walk the loop on purpose and make sure no one else was pushed into it. That is the work, that is the honor. The rest is ceremony and paper. A set of headlights appeared behind me, then held a respectful distance, not tailing me, only sharing the road. The night within the car felt good and clean. When I exhaled, I heard the sound fill the space and then settle. I touched the wooden cross in my pocket with one hand and the lighter with the other. Wood and fire, memory and spark, both small enough to carry, both able to teach a person how to endure. By the time I reached the city named in the message, the edge of the east had softened into a pale band. People were waking up to their ordinary lives, working coffee machines and rubbing their eyes and tying shoes, unaware that a woman in a gray vest with a soldier's posture was about to sit in a parking lot and accept a key that would lead toward a name that had stayed safe too long. I parked where I could see 3 directions and the red glow of a soda machine. I waited without checking the mirror too much. Patience is not a virtue in this line of work, it is a tool. A man walked up the way Duke had, steady, careful, unremarkable from a distance. He held a bag that might have carried a sandwich or a file. He did not look at my face when he reached the door. He placed the bag on the hood, tapped once and kept moving. No words, no lingering. I took the bag 2 minutes later and found a card with a pattern printed on it that only a specific reader would recognize. I had such a reader. I had built it from other people's abandoned machines on a workbench behind a garage that still smelled like oil and rain. There is a moment between getting the thing you need and using it where breath is all you can afford. I sat with that moment and let it teach me how to carry the next hour. Then I started the engine and pulled into the open lane that led out of the lot. The city unrolled ahead, block by block, until it surrendered to the flat that sits between towns and traffic, the long reach where road becomes horizon and horizon becomes a promise you can keep. If justice must live quietly, I will walk quietly beside it. If truth must wear a plain face to survive, I will learn to recognize its eyes in a crowd. I left the memorial on the hill and the tag at its base because honor is not a circle around my neck. It is the way I move when no one else is willing to keep moving. The highway gathered me the way it always does, a simple path made by many feet, not a destiny, only a route that asks the same question over and over. Are you going on? I am, and if tomorrow asks for more than today, then I will give more than today, not because I am chasing a victory, because I am guarding a breath. On that hill 9 names hold still under the sky. In this car 1 name keeps driving. The work continues where no camera can see. The road goes on. I go with it. You have just walked this chapter with me. If you carry a story like this in your own bones, let it breathe. If you believe honor does not die, help keep it alive. Like, share, and subscribe to Military Revenge, so the quiet work of our sisters and brothers is never left in the dark.